Hi there, this is session 4 of our series on Mark's Gospel. Today we're going to be looking at a passage that crosses the boundary in our Bibles from chapter 4 to chapter 5 of Mark. The reason I've chosen that is to just demonstrate some of the ways in which sometimes the numbers in our Bibles can be slightly misleading, or at the very least can stop us from seeing some of the connections that the author is pointing to between the different stories, the different events that he narrates. So let's take a look at it. We start in chapter 4, verse 35, and we end in chapter 5, verse 21. Now, let me give you the main piece of evidence as to why I think this is a bit more of a natural passage to look at than, let's say, just chapter 4 or just chapter 5. If you take a look in chapter 4, verse 35, we have this declaration, "Let us go across to the other side." It's quite a clear and specific phrase. And interestingly, it recurs in chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him. So it's this idea that, for me, that phrase, "to go across to the other side," acts as a bit of a bookmark, showing us that this is a discrete section of the overall story of Mark. A couple of other claims then about it. So first of all, we get the really famous story of Jesus calming the storm. You'll know lots about this, but I just do want to draw your attention to one thing in particular, and that is the links with Psalm 107. Now, they're really strong. So when the disciples asked the question in verse 41, "Who is this then?" My guess is that many of the initial readers and initial listeners would have their response would have been, well, the answer is clear, simply because of the level of crossover with the language of Psalm 107. So let me draw attention, particularly, you can have a look at it for yourself, but let me draw in particular attention to verse 28 and 29. "Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm to be still and the waves of the sea to be hushed." Now, I'm not making any claim that that is the disciples or Jesus that are being spoken about there, but it is speaking about the way that God works. Now, this brings me to my main point about this passage from today, this whole session. If I could give it a subheading, so sometimes if I preach or if I prepare a sermon on a piece, or if I'm doing a piece of interpretive work, I try to boil the passage down. Can I boil it down to one sentence? What is the core idea here that I think summarizes this whole passage? And I think for this passage, I wanna call it, "There's no such thing as beyond." A little bit cryptic, but what I'm getting at is that for me, this whole passage is Mark demonstrating that Jesus is shifting the boundaries. Jesus is redefining for us here who is in, if you like, and who is out. In that there's a section in which, there's a way in which the ancient world thought of as the other side of the lake as being that which is beyond the pale. That's what I mean by in and out. You know, those who are too unclean, who are too far gone, who are too wild, too uncontrollable to be included in God's people, in God's kingdom. And I think this is an overall message where Jesus is being demonstrated as the one who is redrawing those lines and including those who others were saying and were thinking could never possibly be included in God's redemptive plan. Let me give a couple of pieces of evidence for that. So firstly, the sea in the ancient world was, and the reason why Psalm 107 is so powerful is God there is presented as the God for whom nothing is unknowable, nothing is uncontrollable, and nothing is uncountable. So the sea was the symbol of that which was just too mysterious, too dark, too unknowable to be controlled. And therefore fishermen were seen as kind of almost like those who practiced the dark arts. They risked themselves every night, people would think, going out on the unknown, mysterious sea where the chaos lay beneath. And here we have this image of Jesus embodying the God for whom nothing is uncontrollable, for whom nothing is beyond his power. And so that's the very first bit. Now, let's take my subtitle, if you like, "Nothing is Beyond," and let's apply it to the next story as well, because I think that the two are aligned. Look at the language in verse 5. Jesus goes to the tomb, and a man with an unclean spirit meets him there. And look at the description of the man. They could have described him any way they want, but look at it. It's really carefully outlined. The man had often been restrained, but he broke the shackles to pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Really similar to the sea, I think. The sea is the symbol of that which could not be controlled, and Jesus controls it. And so the message here is, as we open this story, that this is another example of that which is beyond, that which was deemed in the ancient world to be beyond God, really, beyond control, beyond inclusion, too far gone. And here we get another example of Jesus reaching out and including this man in the healing, in the restoration of shalom, if you like, as the Old Testament would put it together. This idea of the rightness, the wholeness of all things. He's returned to his right mind in that sense. So what happens is that Jesus calls out the spirits in this man, and they identify themselves, and then they end up in pigs. Now, there's lots and lots of discussion as to what the pigs mean, what happens here. Some people don't like this story. They find it unnecessarily cruel. I suppose I want to interpret it in light of what I've said already. This idea of Jesus redrawing the boundaries of how salvation, of how redemption, of how healing is going to come to the world. And here I want to say that the pig is an example of how even that which is unclean can be used by God to bring healing. So in Leviticus, in the law, the Jewish law, right to this day, for specific reasons we won't go into here, the pig is considered unclean. The pig is not available to be eaten by the Jews. And yet Jesus specifically chooses, and Mark specifically chooses to mention this story in line with two other stories about what I would argue are similar things, to demonstrate that where there's been a line previously drawn between how far God's healing will reach, Jesus now redraws it. He now makes a statement that nothing is beyond, nothing is too unclean to be used as the instrument of God's healing power, used as a tool of God's salvation, if you like. And so here, there's no competition. It's not that, if the Jews benefit, then the Gentiles can't, or even the other way around. If the Gentiles, which is definitely this man in the tomb, where the pigs are, and on the other side of the lake, if he benefits, then somehow the message is diluted. The salvation that's coming to the Jews is somehow challenged. Jesus cuts across all of that here and Mark's Jesus here demonstrates that salvation is coming to both people who live on the different sides of the lake, that healing is going to come in unexpected ways to both the Jews and the Gentiles, and that actually their outcome, their salvation, is connected, and it's not a competition in that sense. I want to demonstrate that with one final point. You may have noticed that in the final verse of our passage, you notice the word Decapolis, and he went away and began to proclaim the Decapolis, how much Jesus had done for him. So this is the really interesting thing about who gets voice again. So this is a pattern that we've seen in previous sessions. Who gets to declare Jesus, and where do they declare him, and how do they declare him? And interestingly, this passage here ends with this man who has been healed, going away and proclaiming in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Now that's really interesting. Decapolis is mentioned a few times in Mark. Now the Decapolis is actually a set of cities. I think it's a set of 10 cities. Let me check. Yes, 10 cities. And it was known in the ancient world, other Jewish historians and other historians attest to this, that it was the place that was known for where the Jewish and Greek cultures most clashed. It was the place which had caused the most trouble in terms of the two cultures living side by side and in parallel. So I suppose what I just want to underline what I've said before, that the idea that this ends with this man going into the Decapolis, the place at the heart of this clash of cultures, shows that the message of Jesus is being declared to both the Jew and the Gentile, both to those at the heart of what is going on and extending out to those who had previously been deemed to be outside of God's love, outside of the accepted religious community. I hope that makes sense. I hope that that's rung some bells for you. I'd be really interested to hear what your discussions throw up. I'm really enjoying following some of the Facebook comments that are going on, and some of the recaps from some of your group leaders. Keep asking questions, keep throwing around ideas, keep questioning what I'm saying, and hopefully we'll continue to find the richness of the life of God in these texts. Hope you're well, and do get in touch if you have any questions.